This is Section 25, the role of purchasing in sales and operations planning, which is actually the next to the last section in the entire global purchasing module. Let's be sure to finish up strong. As noted, purchasing represents the buy side of the supply chain for sales and operations planning. That should be well established. Ultimately, purchasing has to provide both vendor and item-specific input on the feasibility of making adjustments to current procurement plans. Kind of a long bullet, but an important one. Purchasing provides both vendor and item-specific input. Can a vendor do what we need them to do? Related to a specific item. That is the level of input we have to have in purchasing. And then it's all about feasibility. In a global import environment, is it feasible to make certain adjustments? We're going to identify what those adjustments are in just a moment. Last bullet, essentially, the adjustments that we're talking about must be made upon the identification of item-specific variances between forecasted and actual sales. That's a broken record alert we should have given a moment ago, but it's true. Identifying item-specific variances, not necessarily product category variances, footwear, wearing apparel, accessories, as we've mentioned a number of times now in an example, but item-specific variances and what can be done about those variances, if anything. Given the above, there has to be a clear line of sight into outstanding purchase orders for products under consideration, meaning items that have been identified for some needed adjustment in a sales and operations planning meeting, and tying those items into either existing or non-existing purchase orders. This is the key tie-in for purchasing here, because as we well know, the purchase order is what drives what's going to be procured from vendors. And that item-specific focus tied into purchase orders is all about the variances that exist between what's needed in the marketplace and what is reflected on those very purchase orders. Basically, second bullet point, vendor, PO, and item level visibility helps to determine what, if any, changes can be made to product quantities. Remember, we're talking about vendor, PO, item level visibility. That is what purchasing brings to the table. As a trade tip, just because a sales and operations planning exercise reveals the need for product quantity changes, that doesn't mean that purchasing can make it happen. The reality of global trade in both time and space is that sometimes these identified needs cannot be met. That's just the way it is. We have to work closely in both our daily endeavors and sales and operations planning activities to minimize the probability of those circumstances arising. But the whole exercise begins with the acknowledgement that in global trade, sometimes it's just too late. Depending on the circumstances, purchasing can request vendors to make a variety of item-specific changes. For example, increase the quantity of a purchase order. We have a PO out on a vendor. We have a product that's selling really well. Can we go to the vendor and say, hey, can we change that PO from 10,000 items to 20,000? Conversely, can we decrease the quantity of a purchase order? A product isn't selling so well. We go from 20,000 down to 10. That doesn't mean that the vendor's going to say, okay. It means we have to approach the vendor and try to work things out, maybe achieve some middle ground. Perhaps, if things are going really well with a product, we can issue an entirely new PO. Or, if we try to issue a new PO on a vendor and that vendor can't accommodate a new PO, maybe we place it on another vendor. It all depends on the circumstances. Third to the last sub-bullet point, maybe we cancel an existing purchase order, especially if it's within the window for PO cancellation. Another is to convert part of a purchase order from ocean freight to air freight, or, last sub-bullet, ship an entire PO via air freight. We just don't have time to ship via ocean. The whole thing has to go air freight. Lots of different scenarios and circumstances. They all start with a conversation with the vendor. What can we do? How can we partner up to solve an issue? Let's introduce a real-world scenario that helps to illustrate some of the points just made on the previous slide. Meeting immediate demand with air freight. The director of logistics for a large importer of sporting goods is part of the company's sales and operations planning team. This multifunctional group meets biweekly to compare forecasted demand with actual sales and make determinations on how best to align product demand with supply. As an omni-channel organization, the firm's sources of demand include retail stores, online sales, and traditional catalogs. One point of interest that might come out of this first paragraph is that we're talking about the Director of Logistics. Isn't this a module on global purchasing? The obvious answer to that is yes, but we're talking about sales and operations planning, where different functional areas are represented, and the importer relies on the expertise of each area to make the best decisions. This is a purchasing issue we'll see in this real-world scenario, heavily influenced by what the Director of Logistics can bring to the table in terms of market intelligence. One of the product lines that this company imports is NFL-licensed wearing apparel and accessories. One of the not-so-good teams in the NFL is doing exceptionally well this year, and shirt sales are unexpectedly going through the roof. With 12 weeks to go in the season and a 4-week cumulative lead time from the overseas vendor, this item is clearly out of sync between demand and supply. What should the logistics director suggest to alleviate this problem without blowing up landed costs? The obvious point here being that air freight is much more expensive than ocean freight, and it has the potential to blow up landed costs specific to the shirts being brought in. Third paragraph. First, the logistics director has to determine what makes up cumulative lead time. How much of that is production? How much of that is transportation? In this case, she finds out that it is 2 weeks production time and 2 weeks ocean transportation from China to the U.S., undoubtedly to the west coast of the U.S. With super expensive air freight a factor, what the director may suggest is to ship one large lot of shirts via air freight to meet immediate demand and bring in the balance via ocean freight. That way, demand can be met while keeping air freight costs relatively under control. Splitting orders by mode of transport is not unusual. It can be an effective tool to use. Sometimes companies, importers, overreact and they bring in entire POs via air freight. Sometimes that's necessary. In this case, it wasn't. In the end, the Director of Logistics brought expertise to the table that allowed the sales and operations planning team to make the right decision, get some shirts in quickly, and balance things out for the rest of the order and hopefully the rest of the football season. Continuing on with the role of purchasing and sales and operations planning, independent of sales and operations planning calculations, the actions of vendors can create variations between product demand and availability, things that might be a little bit out of our control as an importer. What that means is we have to pay attention to our ongoing supply chain activities and really focus on them in a sales and operations planning environment. What are some of those independent actions that we're talking about? Well, first, a vendor could make an error in master production scheduling. They took on too many purchase orders from too many customers. They don't have the capacity, and now things are out of whack, which in turn impacts us as the importer. Another reality independent of sales and operations planning is a vendor's inability to acquire needed raw materials. This could be especially so in a build-to-order environment where the vendor, the supplier, doesn't go out for raw materials until they actually receive an order, and then they discover that there's a shortage of raw materials. That's a problem too. Something as mundane as a late production run could wreak havoc on an importer's supply chain, independent of sales and operations planning calculations. The vendor is just late. We have to be aware of those things too. Products that are rejected for quality reasons, whereby we as the importer, either at origin or destination, are rejecting goods because they don't meet quality standards. That will blow up sales and operations planning in a major way. In continuation of this theme, things that happen independent of sales and operations planning calculations, a vendor might miss a booking window. We've talked about having policies in place with overseas suppliers about the time within which they have to make a booking for a container or containers on a given sailing, typically 15 days as an industry standard. If they miss that window, it's going to extend lead time and have a negative impact on the importer. A missed sailing window, never mind a missed booking, a vendor could very easily make a booking and then not show up with the container or containers for a specific sailing. Needless to say, that will impact our supply chain and ultimately sales and operations planning too. An unwillingness on the part of the vendor to pay for expedited air freight. Making a decision around air freight is one thing, converting ocean freight to air freight. The question of who's going to pay for that becomes a whole other conversation. The circumstances under which a supplier versus an importer pays for air freight should be clearly outlined in a service level agreement, a standard operating procedure, somewhere in writing. Because it is not unusual for an importer to want to bring in goods via air freight, convert from ocean to air, and then the vendor says, go right ahead, except we're not paying for it. That's not good for S&OP either. And then finally, a theme we've talked about a couple of times, missing or incorrect documents that cause customs delays. You should remember the 3 C's of documentation that we spoke of in previous modules. But missing docs, hard copy or soft copy, and the information on those documents, if they're not present, shipments aren't going anywhere. They're not leaving the country of origin, and they're certainly not getting into the country of importation. These are all factors that can blow up sales and operations planning that are vendor specific. We're going to end this section here and come back for the final section of global purchasing. It's the last one, so come back right away.